Iuno is coming out soon, and that got me thinking about all the currently existing Sub DPS characters. When it comes to pull value, I've always had the belief that Sub DPS limited 5 stars are simply a worse investment than either a DPS or a pure support. But Iuno flips this idea right on its head, so let's talk about that. First, I want to discuss every single Sub DPS character in the game and discuss their limiting factors, which ultimately cause them to be of lower value in my opinion. And then finally, I want to talk about the 2 Sub DPSs that I believe do it the best, being Brant and Iuno. But first, we have to discuss Yinlin. She was the one who started it all after all. The very first limited 5-star Sub DPS character, and I believe that it really shows in her current performance. Yinlin is, in my opinion, one of the worst 5-star Sub DPS characters when it comes to the limited roster, and there's plenty of reasons to believe this. While her damage output is one of the highest among all of them, that's kind of where it kind of just ends with Yinlin's benefits. Her on-field performance is nothing to really look at, with most of it really being dedicated towards coordinated attacks. And even then, these coordinated attacks serve as marks on the enemies, which means that when those enemies die, your Yinlin kinda stops bringing you value. So Yinlin is incredibly limited in how she's able to pump out her damage. Then there is her Ultra skill, buffing electro damage and liberation damage. However, well, we haven't exactly had any liberation-based DPS since Shang Liao, and on the electro side of things, it's almost just as dire. We did just get Augusta, who also happens to be an electro DPS that Yinlin works well with. However, Mortefi kinda steals the entire spotlight by being simply way better while also being cheaper. So not only is Yinlin incredibly limited when it comes to which character she's able to buff, her damage output also relies on way too many factors to actually be strong, rather than a character like Brant or Iuno who just kinda does their damage. Next up, we got Zhezhi in version 1.2. From a design perspective, Zhezhi really is not an upgrade over Yinlin at all when it comes to how long she's going to last. She simply has the fortune of playing with Carlotta, who is currently one of the best DPS characters in the game. But here's the thing, when Carlotta falls off, so will Zhezhi. When Jinchi falls off, so will Zhezhi. Zhezhi is entirely being carried by these 2 characters in specific, and I believe that if you do not have a Carlotta or a Jinchi, there's simply no reason to pull a Zhezhi ever. Her entire value is simply tied to those 2 characters. So while she's good right now, you have to ask yourself the question, for how long will this be the case? While her damage isn't nearly as conditional as Yinlin's, it's also just lower, meaning that she's not really going to be as good when it comes to brute forcing herself into any teams. She does have some energy restoration on her Ultra skill, but let's be real here, this alone is not enough to put Zhezhi with just about any skill damage dealer. She really is primarily going to work well with characters like Carlotta, who are Glacio and skill damage, and then she's also currently good with Jinchi because Jinchi is strapped for other options. And then the next sub DPS characters we got was Roccia. I don't think I need to spell it out for you guys, but I don't think that Roccia is that good of a character either. Again, from how her kit is designed, there really isn't that much that she's doing wrong. She really isn't that big of an offender, and I actually believe that her kit is more well designed than Zhezhi or Yinlin, because those 2 characters are reliant on coordinated attacks, and thus do not put most of their damage up front, like the 2 characters I want to compliment being Iuno and Brant. So what is Roccia's issue? Well, Roccia's only sin was buffing basic attacks, which means that she has to compete with Sanhua. Competing with Sanhua is an automatic death sentence for most sub DPS characters, which is why the next basic attack buffer we got, being Lupa, got so many buffs in her kit, because if she didn't, she would have been way easier to replace. But we'll talk more about Lupa when we get to her. But that's just in the Camellia team. Roccia did end up getting a second team after all, being the Felova team. But guess what? In here, she's also the most replaceable character of the bunch. And I believe that the second that we get an Echo buffer, Roccia is gone. And much like Zhezhi and Yinlin before her, Roccia does not bring enough utility to brute force herself into any other teams. she does actually have a built-in buff within her kit, being a 200 attack buff from her liberation. But this alone is not enough to justify putting her into a team, because her 200 attack buff can be equivalated to a Sanhua S6 buff, which means that, yet again, she has to be competing with Sanhua, and even other characters like Mortefi and Donjin have the exact same S6. So this buff is simply too small to really force Roccia into any teams that isn't her best in slot teams. Which means that, yet again, Roccia's entire value is tied to Frolova and Camellia. And in Camellia teams, she's already super replaceable, and with Frolova, she's also the most replaceable. It's why I believe Roccia to not be a good character, simply because she is replaceable in every team she tries to enter. And this is going to be the fate of most Sub DPS characters that have this sort of design. Now, we got Brant in 2.1, but obviously I want to save him for later. Which brings us to version 2.2 and Cantarella, which is where we get yet another example of a character whose value is entirely tied to the main DPS they work with, in this case being only Frolova. Now, one thing that Cantarella does well that Roccia does not do is that Cantarella is more valuable to a Frolova team than Roccia is to either a Camellia or a Frolova team. And thus, Cantarella ends up being harder to replace, and thus, as long as Frolova has value, Cantarella will as well, because her being replaced is kinda hard. Cantarella's issue, however, is that, much like Zhezhi and Yinlin, Cantarella really isn't going to be slotted into any other team. She has her best in slot, and that's it. She has nothing else. Sure, you could put her in a Camellia team, but she's worse than Donjin. You could put her with your Chongli, but honestly at that point you're just playing an incredibly bad team. Cantarella's kit is really inflexible. She generates like no energy, she has a really long rotation, and her Echo Skill gimmick currently only works with Frolova, which means that the second Frolova falls off, Cantarella will as well. That brings us to version 2.3 Ciaccona. Now, Ciaccona does actually have some additional teams other than the team she was designed for, but a lot of this isn't due to Ciaccona herself. Rather, it's through a combination of Arrow Rover and her signature weapon. Ciaccona is actually one of the best generalist arrow buffers in the game, being best in slot with DPS Iuno, as well as being an incredibly powerful option for GN. But why do I put Ciaccona in this segment then, rather than the segment of Sub DPS characters who do things correctly? Well, simple. A lot of Ciaccona's value in these teams is tied to her signature weapon. Most of the buffs Ciaccona herself gives are rather underwhelming. The amplification for arrow erosion really is only being utilized in a Cardathea team, and then there is also 24% arrow damage bonus, which I guess is cool. But what you really want to look for when you're putting Ciaccona into your GN team, you're really looking for that signature weapon, the 10% resistance shred. That's the thing that makes Ciaccona so good in these teams. Even in a Cardathea team, that weapon is helping a lot, almost as much as Cardathea's signature weapon. So I do believe that Ciaccona does do a better job than a majority of limited Sub DPS characters, but it's not her doing it. It's her weapon. And while her weapon is technically tied to her because it's her weapon, that just means you need to pull for an extra thing in order to make your Ciaccona good in anything outside of a Cardathea team. She is also capable of working in Phoebe teams due to her ability to apply Spectrofrazzle from off-field. But this isn't because she's good for Phoebe. This is because she's the only one who can do that. The second we get a 4-star character who can do that, you should never pull Ciaccona for your Phoebe. And this brings us to Lupa, who is the final character to talk about before we get on to the good stuff. Lupa is actually a pretty good sub DPS, and she has a ton of buffs in her kit, which was kind of necessary because she's another basic attack buffer. But that's not the point here. Lupa is a buffer for specifically mono fusion teams, while also being good for any fusion basic attacking character. She shares a lot of the design flaws of these earlier sub DPS characters, where her damage output is very restricted unless you want to go for an awkward rotation, but she makes up for that by having a ton of buffs in her kit, specifically ones dedicated to fusion. This is what, in my opinion, kinda saves Lupa. Her buffs are incredibly powerful, and they're not niche at all. They're tailored towards the entire element of fusion. But as you can probably guess here, this means that Lupa's value falls off of a cliff if you do not have any fusion characters. But I do have to admit that this is a lot better than really only having one DPS to work with. So yeah, good on you, Lupa. But the two sub DPS characters that I truly believe are the best when it comes to being versatile and having high value are Brant and Iuno. And these two characters really just share two big things in common. One of which being high damage output, being actually the two highest in the game in the sub DPS class, as well as not having any restrictions on this damage. While technically Brant does really want his Liberations buff in order to generate Forte faster, this is not a strict requirement, and you are able to work around the extra time by doing quick swaps or just pre-stacking your Forte. And as for Iuno, while her Moonbow attacks do get a buff if you have Sentience, you don't actually need to have any Sentience on your Iuno to do good damage with her Moonbow basics. And what these two things mean for these characters are the fact that you can actually main DPS them. Brant with either Sanhua or Lupa, and then you can run Iuno main DPS with either Ciaccona or Yinlin. This means that unlike every other sub DPS 5-star, their value is not tied to other characters being good or being on your account. Ciaccona is always going to be tied to Arrow, and even more specifically Arrow Erosion. Lupa is always going to be tied to Fusion. But your Brant and your Iuno are going to be completely fine even if you do not have a specific other character. You can just main DPS them, and then if you want to use them as a sub DPS later, you can. Brant's incredibly high personal damage makes him the second best in slot for any skill DPS character. And then for Iuno, her Ultra skill doesn't even have an element restriction, meaning she is going to be good for every single heavy attack DPS in the game. So I believe that Iuno and Brant are the best and most valuable sub DPSs in the entire game, simply because they're not restricted by anything. You can pull them and make them useful on any account. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, if you have any questions, join my Discord, which is linked in the description. If you want to see more of me as a person, you can also check a different link in the description to check out my second channel. I primarily post PGR, but I kinda just make videos about whatever. But that'll be all from me. Peace.